just for all of you who are not here this morning, this session is being videotaped, and it will be put on the website, and a book will be produced from the papers of this conference, and then another conference we'll either have or individual speakers will have in the spring. So between the two, we will have sufficient papers for a book. This conference is being co-sponsored by the History Department, the Glasscock Center, and the Scowcroft Institute at the Bush School. And we have a distinguished panel who will be introduced by Professor Adam Sipe, who's from the History Department, who is moderating, not mediating,
Something.
this afternoon's session. So, Adam, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm deeply honored to be here in front of this audience and with this panel to consider the very, very important questions of how Europe, in all of its many and sometimes interworking component parts, is responding to the challenge of a newly assertive or a renewedly assertive Russia. So I have to my left three very distinguished guests who need relatively little introduction, but I will introduce them anyway. And I will I'll take my prerogative and introduce the speakers as they prepare to speak, so that each person gets a proper introduction and so that we can all remember who we're listening to at any given time. Our first speaker for this afternoon's panel is Dr. Temuri Yakobashvili, who is the former ambassador of the Republic of Georgia to the United States. In addition, he is a longtime senior official in the Georgian government. Before he was ambassador to the United States, he was deputy prime minister and state minister for reintegration for the for the government of Georgia. In that capacity, he was instrumental in working with some of the border issues that continue to engage in the Caucasus today. He is someone who is deeply qualified to talk about the engagement of Russia's neighbors with Russia, and we welcome him to the stage today.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me express my gratitude to organizers for organizing this timely conference and to invite me here to address together with such a distinguished people. I think that in a title, in the Putin's Russia, it's the first time actually that I see Americans put it in correctly, that we are indeed talking about Putin's Russia, because one of the biggest confusion that you can meet in Washington circles inside the Beltway, that people do not really see difference between Pushkin and Putin. And I also want to make a disclaimer that when I talk about Russia, basically I'm talking about Putin and his government, not the Russian people or Russian literature or Russian culture, which I am a great admirer of. So one should really distinguish that that's not what Russian people deserve, but that's what they have and what we have to deal with. And that these are two different things. In order to understand why and what exactly is happening now with that particular country, we have to remember a little bit of the Soviet history. And one of the proud jokes of Soviet Union was that on the question what countries Soviet Union borders with, answer was whatever it chooses to. Why I'm bringing this joke? Because in my humble opinion, what is happening now with Russia, the basics of it has to do not with neighbors or with Americans or Europeans or oil or gas or something like that, but it has to do with the identity. It's a very serious identity crisis that we are seeing now in Russia and among the Russian political circles. Why I say so? Because we have to yet again remember what is the Russian state. And I remember my conversations with Russian opposition leaders, one of them, and then I said, look, you have to understand that Putin is not patriot of the Russian Federation. For him, whatever you call Russia today is not his country. It's not the Soviet Union is his country. He understands that there is no way that you are going to recreate Soviet Union, which was more ideologically based creation than anything else. He's not bringing that ideology. So any talks that he wants to restore Soviet Union can be easily defeated by any Russians, because he's not trying to restore the Soviet Union. What he's trying to do, in my opinion, I'll tell you right away. The problem with the Russian state is that if we will look back to the history, we will see only two countries or two empires that did not exist as a form of nation state before they became empires. We know that there was France, and then it expanded into French Empire, and when shrinking back, it's still France, more or less. Same was with Portugal and Portuguese Empire, Spanish Empire, and the Dutch empires, and Brits and others. So they're more or less coming back to the original size, more or less. Again, some more, some less. The Habsburg Empire was just divided in several countries. And there were only two empires that never existed as a nation state before. One of them was the Ottoman Empire, and second was the Russian Empire. People may say, what about Kievskaya Rus and the Kievian Russia, Rus, and all these narratives about Ukrainians and Russians being the same people. These are fantasies of a couple of guys. One of them was called Karamzin, who invented the Russian history, who tried to blend the vision of the Russian state into the European roots, and tried to mix, quite artificially, I must say, these relationships that people who live now currently on Russian territory with its neighbors, and especially the European part of it with the people that lived in Kiev, modern Ukrainians. In the beginning of the 20th century, before revolution, there were a lot of discussions among Russian intellectuals. What is Russia? What is the Russian state? It's exactly the same period of time when we had Ataturk in modern Turkey, who was trying to define the modern Turkish state. And unfortunately, what happened, either there was not a person who would take that challenge in Russia, or something more horrible happened, which was the revolution. I mean, the socialist revolution, which basically conserved that effort for another 70-something years, and gave a false feeling of the greatness to the people of current Russian Federation. So we had a Russian Empire, now we had a Soviet Empire, much larger and much bigger, and we are so great and powerful. And we are ruling the 1/6 of the world, and realistically ruling half of the world. So it's very interesting that after Putin came to power, his initial years, I would say initial 2 terms, was exactly what people before me were trying to describe, that, kleptocratic regime, stealing money, redistribution of properties, making huge amounts of money. Okay, he made money. He and his circle made money. And then there was a question, what it means for us, how we are going to use this money, what are we going to do with it, how much you can eat, how much you can buy. You can buy all the luxury goods, fine, we did it. You can buy the fancy cars, we did it. You can buy villas in Italy and France and God knows what, Florida, okay, we did it. Then what? And then I think the Russian elite, the current elite, started to ask questions that Putin always had in his mind, because he left when there was a Soviet Union, and he came back to different country from his posting from Germany. The Soviet Union was not there anymore. And that search of new identity was taking very interesting path. Initially, it's supposed to be a CIS, Commonwealth of the Independent States. You remember that organization, right? It still semi-exists. Which should be a Russo-centric world of political and economic affairs. But it proved to be very ineffective, and countries, even countries of the Central Asia, started to drift away and started to ask for more autonomy in decision-making. And then there was an idea of liberal empire. You remember that idea? It was still there. It's still there somehow. When there was an attempt to imagine something greater than the Russian Federation. Then there was the idea of the customs union that's supposed to bring together former Soviet republics plus other countries into the Russo-centric world or the centered on Russia. And now we hear about Eurasian Economic Union, which basically should be the same kind of construct politically. And of course, I'm not talking about Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, which Russia tried to share with China some future of the Eurasia. And entire Eurasianism idea that is very much embraced by two other countries, Kazakhstan and Turkey, is also not really a new idea. The idea goes to, white Russians, during the revolution. So you see this search of the new identity that is A, not current Russian Federation, and B, much bigger than current Russian Federation. So we are going back to the basic questions, where are the Russian borders? Because for most of the people, not only political elite, the current borders of Russian Federation are inherently unfair. You will see those who will advocate that we should not really keep and feed, as in Russian, some people say, the Northern Caucasus, and you see the slogans, enough feeding the Caucasus. You would meet people and saying that, Crimea was given as a gift by Khrushchev to Ukrainians, and by the way, entire Ukraine should not be really independent, and Putin openly said that this is not a country. The same applies to Belarusians. Almost same applies to Moldova, which partly should be part of Romania, and probably another part should be part of Russia, and et cetera, and et cetera. So you have actually a country whose population has not really understanding of its own borders, where the country starts and ends. There's another country like that's called Israel, which is unsure about its borders, but for different reasons. So it's not only Putin himself or the one elite, but it's probably much larger public that is unsure about its own borders and unsure about its own identity. There was a very interesting experiment on Russian TV, on the public TV. There was a search of some historic figures or historic events that you would base the new Russian mythology. So part of it was to ask to the public who was the greatest Russian person or hero in the Russian history. And people close to that TV, actually, those who worked in that TV, told me that they had to falsify results because results were horrifying, because people were voting for Stalin. So if you really want to build some kind of new narrative, you don't necessarily have one crazy Georgian, who killed millions of people as your biggest historic figure. So, and they had to switch to somebody else, and they switched to even more mythical person. Now, Stalin was very real, Alexander Nevsky, which by historic documents either never existed, or if he existed, he was a representative of the Golden Horde into Moscow, or whenever the events related to this particular person happened, allegedly, he was 7 years old and was in Mongolia and not in that time part of Mongolia, the Russia. So this confusion about Russian identity is leading to actions. And if Russian leadership believes that these borders are unfair, then it has to challenge these borders. So you cannot challenge really borders without challenging the international system that was created right after the end of the Cold War. And there was a consensus, and one of my previous speakers here said that the problem with Russia is that it's after Saddam Hussein, that Putin is the second person who is challenging these basics of the international system, because international system is built on the premises that borders are, you know, some kind of holy cows that you cannot really violate. Unless countries themselves decide to split, you cannot really violate borders by force. So what Putin does is actually challenging borders and automatically challenging international system. And for him, country like Georgia or Ukraine going to the West, being members of NATO or members of EU, would automatically mean end of his constructs, whatever he wanted to call it. In Ukrainian case, it was called, Eurasian Union. So it's very clear that if you want to be part of, we want to have a association agreement with and deep, free and comprehensive agreement with the European Union, you cannot be in the same time member of the Eurasian Union. And it's a technicality, it's not a political decision, it's a technically you cannot do the both. So for Russia, Georgia joining the NATO was something of the same size, of same magnetism, that then the Caucasus is gone to NATO because the others will follow the Georgia's case. So in his own mind, these are not a really country. Georgia was not a country, it was more restaurant than the country, like what people do in restaurants, having a good time. You have a good food, good dances, good music, that's what Georgians have, good ambience, so that's we have it also. So how a restaurant can be a country? It cannot. And suddenly Georgia was not only a country, but a successful country. In his understanding, Ukrainians are not even a nation, and he said it loudly. The unfortunate truth is that all previous governments of Ukraine actually behaved that way, and they behaved like termites who have eaten inside everything and left only shell called the Ukrainian state, because there were no functioning institutions. So that identity crisis led to redefinition of the Putin's vision of what Russia is. So I basically disagree that Putin has no future plan. He has a plan. They finally arrived to that plan prematurely, but after this Eurasian idea, there is a new idea which is very compelling for people inside Russia. It's called Russian world, Rossiyskiy mir, which is much larger, again without borders, but it reached to the territories of former Soviet Union and more. And if we believe in the United States that, you know, the augmented reality is on the Silicon Valley, or, you know, web-based things exist and the Americans are championing, no. Augmented reality exists very much in the Putin's head and his leadership, and they are very, very effective in promoting and addressing this new notion of the Russian world very aggressively and very successfully. If you look at the Russian propaganda, it's extremely professional and extremely effective. And the fact that they are saying lies and outrageous lies is not changing the reality. If you see those people who are advocating for Putin, they are not all bought or crazies. They just have a buy-in into those lies. I mean, we heard even in this audience that Ukrainians are killing children. I'm not sure that there are hard evidences that Ukrainians are killing children. They are very well documented that Russian soldiers killed 150,000 Chechens, among them 40,000 kids. which we cannot, I'm sorry, call the collateral damage, because it was a targeted assassination of a very specific nation and their kids. And you see stories in the Russian TV like 10-year-old boy was crucified by these fascist Ukrainians, which is a completely made-up story. But you have to understand that people who are getting this story and starting to believe in it because they have no other alternatives, sources of information, they genuinely get guns and go to kill so-called fascists in Ukraine. So saying that propaganda is not working and the Second World War is gone, it's not gone. It's still there, very much there. People still buy in the 70-year-old narrative that there are fascists out there that we have to fight. And Putin very effectively mobilized his own population against Ukrainian on the notion that we are fighting fascists. We are fighting some banderas. And again, the big lies. I mean, any sane people can tell you that Bandera was not that crazy, he was not a fascist, but that propaganda works. So based on how much Putin will be successful in the days to come in challenging the international system and making life of its neighborhood miserable, it depends on the many factors. And I would just mention only two. First, it will be an ability of this immediate neighborhood to withstand the pressure coming from Russia. With current policy of United States and Europe, is not going to happen. Nobody has an illusion that either Georgians or Ukrainians or Azerbaijanis or Kazakhs or Belarusians are expecting any American troops on the ground. But what we all are expecting, at least help to defend ourselves. So depriving Ukrainians defensive weapons is a shame. And I hope it will be soon fixed. Empowering the Russian neighbors to be better countries for the sake of Russia itself will be an important ingredient of fixing whatever we want to call Russia or whatever they want to call Russia. And it's not a new idea. There are plenty of books how to handle Russia, and almost all of them are coming to the conclusion the best way to handle Russia is to fix its neighborhood. Not as Russians sell it, that it's a suffocation, suffocating Russia, creating some cordon sanitaire around us. We are talking about creating democratic states around Russia and helping Russians to democratize themselves. And ironically, when Russians are saying that NATO is a boogeyman, the only secured borders the Russian Federation has are with NATO countries. And I remember when the Europeans were telling me, oh, they are against NATO, they are fine with EU. I was saying, no, that's not true. Because realistically, Russians are not afraid of, in the leadership of NATO, because they know very well that NATO is not going to attack Russia or grab its territory or do something like that. But European Union, let's be frank, will take the markets from Russians. And they should be concerned about it. There might be some legitimate concerns, but it's ultimately still against it's a decision of the countries themselves, like Ukraine and others, where they want to be and what they want to join. But this misreading of Russian Federation for such a long time, reset of Americans, miserably failing resets, and attempts of Europeans to engage in these or other forms, and Condoleezza Rice telling to me that, oh, I know Russians, they don't want war, when Russian airplanes were flying, military airplanes, over the capital of Georgia. These misreadings are leading to the serious mistakes of how you handle Russia, and guess who suffers the most? Russian people, and then Russian neighbors, and then international system. The very system that this particular country and other European countries are supposed to be guarantors of. We are in the Bush school, so it was Bush's legacy to create that post-Cold War system that functioned well and gave stability and prosperity to hundreds of millions of people in Eastern Europe. And now that particular legacy is challenged. And again, people talked about practicalities and policy recommendations and what to do. There are three things that should be done. Empower Russian neighborhood, counter Russian propaganda, and help Russian democratic forces to convince their population that there is a other way to develop. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yakobashvili. Our second speaker today is Dr. James Corum, who comes to us from the University of Salford in England, where he is Professor of Terrorism and Security Studies, a position that he began fairly recently after serving for a number of years as Dean of the Baltic Defense College in Estonia, an experience that will no doubt condition some of what he has to say today. Dr. Corum is a very distinguished historian of warfare, and particularly warfare in Europe. He's the author of 8 books. The first part of his career dealing mostly with the history of air power in Germany, and the second mainly with the pitfalls of counterinsurgency. He is a widely read and cited author on security issues in Europe, and we're very pleased to have him here. So, Jim.
Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see some old friends. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference for placing me directly after Dr. Yakobashvili because he set the foundation. I'll be talking, furthering some of the things, the brilliant points that he just made. I am not a Russia expert by nature, but I've just spent 5.5 years working in the Baltic states as Dean of their Defense College of the 3 countries and as an employee of the 3 Baltic defense ministries. And I think this gives me some perspective from the Baltic viewpoint. And as one dear friend of mine, Latvian Brigadier General Gundars Abels used to say, he said, James, you know, the Poles, they know something about the Russians, but you know, they had their own language, a little bit of their own space. They had some flexibility, nominal independence. But we Baltics, we were inside the Soviet Union. We know these people. And this is true, all of the Baltics. And I've done some work for the Army War College, wrote a monograph on the security perceptions of the Baltic states that comes from interviewing ministers, generals, think tank leaders, and so forth in all 3 countries. So you're getting the Baltic view. And the Baltics are a great place to understand Russia. The historical memories of the Soviet Union are very, very recent. The gulags, the KGB. I know people, several people, who spent time in the gulags. I know Estonians of my own age who are my friends who were born in Kazakhstan. They didn't send them all to Siberia. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan were favorite place. They know Russia, they know the Russian media, and they watch the Russian media. And they're facing a real threat, but they don't want to seem alarmist. And so you have the reality of some very democratic, successful nations facing a very mean and aggressive neighbor. Now, history is the key. I'm a historian, and I hope you'll indulge me a little bit. But the key point is, in geography, culture, language, economics, and political development, the 3 Baltic states are very much Western European countries. Going back to the Middle Ages, this area, which are not ethnically Russian or linguistically Slavic, it was the Germans and Danes that sent the missionaries and the merchants, the Teutonic Knights, and built these states that were linked to the Holy Roman Empire. We're talking Latvia and Estonia. Finland, of course, was an integral part of Sweden, was conquered by the Swedes. And the Hansa cities, which used German law, Lübeck and Hamburg, the Baltic, Riga, Pärnu, Tartu, where I lived, Tallinn, were all connected to Western Europe and the Western European trade system. And so the region developed differently, and of course, eventually most of it comes under the Swedish Empire and only becomes Russian in the 1700s under Peter the Great. You have this very powerful Western medieval heritage. And there's the Baltic region. Now, the Baltic region under Peter the Great was set aside, as was Finland after the Napoleonic Wars when it was conquered, as separate self-governing autonomous regions. And this was governed by a council of German nobles, Latvia and Estonia. And so they remained culturally and economically Western. The religion in Finland, the overwhelming majority, is Lutheran. The overwhelming majority of the Estonians and Latvians are Lutherans, and of course the Lithuanians, with their long connection to Poland, are Catholic. So the Baltics before World War I, this was the most advanced region of Russia. The lingua franca, by the way, in Latvia and Estonia until 1918 was German. All the official documents, so forth, German. In fact, they didn't have that much to do with Russians, except the fact that Russian rule or Russian governorship, they pretty much developed their own cultures. In the 19th century, they developed a very strong sense of nationalism, national leadership, national literature in all the Baltic states and in Finland. And this was the most prosperous region of the old Russian Empire. They had universal literacy in Livonia in 1800, 150 years before Russia reached that position. They had great universities and centers of learning at Tartu and Riga. They abolished serfdom 50 years. In the Baltic states, they abolished serfdom 50 years before they abolished it in Russia. This was the high-tech region and industrial region of Russia. 1914 in Riga was the most modern city of Eastern Europe. It was not a Russian-speaking city, it was a German-speaking city, and they produced automobiles, airplanes, and high-tech things in Riga. World War I comes, the Russian Empire collapses, and these countries, which were highly developed Western countries, chose and fought for their independence. Now, with the help of the Germans and the British, the Baltic countries defeated the Red Army. In fact, the Estonians fought 22 major battles with the Russian army, 1919, 1920, each time outgunned and outnumbered, and they beat the Russians every time, and it came to the Peace of Tartu in 1920. Pretty brilliant performance by these little countries. Now, by the way, I don't think the Russians have ever forgiven the Baltics for having defeated them. But once they won independence, the three Baltic states built modern Western governments, and they oriented themselves to the West with democratic governments. And as Russia was going through the poverty and suppression of the 1920s, the Baltics were actually quite prosperous. And these were the years that George Kennan and the American diplomats were operating in Riga, and that was our listening post. We used the Baltics as our listening post to the Soviet Union. But by the late 1930s, the Baltics enjoyed a Western European standard of living and prosperity. Then came the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23rd, 1939, and Hitler and Stalin agreed on spheres of influence, and Finland and the Baltic states, and of course half of Poland, were to come under the Soviet Union. And shortly after, the Soviet Union demanded large military bases in the Baltic states and in Finland. Finland turned down the Russian request and ended up in war with the Soviet Union, a very bloody, short war that ended in March 1940 with Finland's defeat, but with also massive Soviet losses. But the Baltics gave in. They allowed the Soviet Union to put large military bases there. Then on the 17th of June, 1940, the 16th of June, an ultimatum was given to the three Baltic states, essentially to surrender their sovereignty and allow the Red Army in, and they did. They decided it was not worth it, they couldn't win, and so they allowed the Red Army in, and the takeover began. And at that point, the Baltic states, the leaders were arrested. Virtually all of them were secretly executed. An election was forced in the Baltic states with only one list of candidates selected by the Communist Party, and they were quickly voted in as republics of the Soviet Union. And all through 1940, 41, and I have a number of numbers in here, Baltic elites were arrested, deported, and mostly executed. Complete suppression of freedom. And there are some numbers. Again, we're talking of countries of a couple million people each, and these are pretty large numbers. And parts of Latvia and Estonia were transferred to Russia. Okay, post-World War II saw incredible levels of oppression in the Baltic states. The land was collectivized, all private property was confiscated. There were seven or eight major waves of mass arrests. This is not just arresting men, leaders of families. This is arresting entire families. There was massive destruction of books and periodicals, and essentially anybody who, with an education, middle class, was suspect. Lutheran ministers all went to the camps. And again, here's some of the numbers just from one of the waves of the Estonians. Again, Estonia is a country of 1.4 million people, 21,000 Estonians, 42,000 Latvians, and so on. And some of the photographs. And again, sent to Kazakhstan, Siberia, with little to no food, and huge numbers of them died. And this was a photograph taken secretly in Estonia, the KGB arresting the Baltics. And this was conditions of the Baltics who left prosperous, middle-class, Western European standard houses and how they lived deep in the Soviet Union. And of course, there were large Balt communities of Balts that had been deported that remained in far deep into Siberia and Kazakhstan right up to re-independence in 1991. And just 100 yards from my office in Tartu was the regional KGB headquarters. And the basement is a museum today. And there are some of they have the torture cells there. And if you want to know how all of this worked, you just read Solzhenitsyn. It's a very stark reminder. And all through the Baltics, they have the former KGB offices, and they have the museums, and they have careful and vast documentation of all of the murders, the oppressions, the KGB operations, and so on. But the Baltics didn't go down without a fight. After World War II, there was large-scale partisan warfare conducted because these are sparsely populated lands, heavily forested, and the Forest Brothers, resistance fighters, existed in all three states. There were up to 50,000 partisans in Lithuania after the war. It required 100,000 NKVD troops with tanks and aircraft to suppress the Lithuanians. Estonia and Latvia, there was guerrilla warfare. This extended on into the 1950s, this fighting and resistance. Now, the population redistribution, as the Baltics were moved to, vast numbers of them were moved to Siberia and Kazakhstan, ethnic Russians were moved in to change the ethnic complexion of the Baltic states. One corner of Estonia, up at Narva, the entire region was cleared. Every single Estonian was dispossessed, was thrown out of their house, and they moved Russians in. In fact, to this day, 93% in that one corner of Estonia of the population is ethnic Russian. Now, today, there are significant ethnic Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia, and this is a problem, and we'll talk about this later. And this is the change. In 1945, most of the people in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians. But you see the movement out of Baltics and the movement in, and of course by 1989, Latvia is barely more than 50% Latvian. Now this is a modern picture because this is a big issue when we're talking about Putin, because Putin has entire propaganda campaigns all geared to deal with, to support, and to propagandize, to enrage the ethnic Russians in the Baltic states. And of course, Putin claims the right of Russia to intervene to protect the interest of ethnic Russians anywhere. But you can't keep the Baltic states down. And they remained, through the Soviet era, fiercely nationalistic. And in fact, it would be an interesting conference topic to themselves, how these countries maintained their national identity. In Estonia, it was music festivals. In Latvia, it was folk dancing festivals. Lithuania, they held on to their Catholicism. All of these things were allowed under the Soviets, but under the surface, they maintained a fierce nationalism. And there was also a lot of Baltics in 1945-44 who had fled to the Western countries, ended up in America, in Canada, and Sweden. And the Estonians had access to the West because for various reasons of trade, they couldn't jam the Finnish television, so all of northern Estonia got to see the American TV shows. Dallas was quite popular as the TV show in Estonia back in the Cold War. 1980s, the Helsinki Agreement was very important. That provided some cover and opportunity. And as the Soviet rule declined, the Baltic nationalism came out. Now, this is on the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. 2 million people from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, from the three capitals, from Tallinn to Riga to Vilnius, 400 miles, formed a human chain in protest, in unity of the Baltic states, and in protest of the Russian invasion and occupation of the Baltic states. And you see the flags, the national flags flying, which of course is a criminal offense in the Soviet Union at that time. But this is close to 30% of the total population, and so they couldn't arrest them all. And the important thing, I think this is possibly the largest peaceful political protest demonstration in history. I don't know of any others that include 2 million people. Now, the key event, 1989, was a decision of the Republic's three governments and the Soviet government to review the 1939 Hitler-Stalin Pact. And there was a board of historians that examined the secret protocols. And the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR in December 1989 voted a law to condemn the secret protocols and establish that they had no legal basis. Now, with this law, basically, the Soviet Union was telling the Baltic states that they agreed with the Baltic position that there was no legal foundation for the Soviet Union to have marched in and taken over the Baltic states. In fact, one of the first things the Baltic states do in 1990, of course, they'll start declaring independence. They'll have referenda in which there will be overwhelming majorities voting for independence. And the first thing that the Latvian and the Estonian republics say is that because the takeover, the occupation of the Soviet Union was legally invalid, as accepted by the Soviet government, then therefore the de jure, the constitutions and laws and the states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania never went out of existence. In fact, when they do get independence, they'll simply restore their pre-war constitutions. 1991, after the coup, they all declare, again, their independence is recognized by the West, reluctantly recognized by Russia. They negotiate the Russians to leave in 1994, and just about the day after the last Russian soldier leaves, all three Baltic countries say, our intention is to join NATO. There was very little disagreement about this in the Baltic countries. They were going to go Western. They kept nothing of the Soviet system. Their economies, everything was to go West, and their security was going to go West. And so they put in very good laws. There was a lot of assistance from the Nordic countries. And 10 years later, in 2004, they had progressed so far that they all joined the European Union on the same day. They also joined NATO all on the same day. And from 1991 on, the Baltic states cooperated very closely. It's an amazing thing to see how closely these three countries cooperate, even though they're all quite distinct with distinct national cultures. They have joint military commands. They have joint military education. I was dean of the Baltic Defense College, which is the only higher military staff college, war college in the world that's owned and equally operated by three countries, with the command language, the language for everything being in English. Now, the nations that took the two paths, there were two paths in the early 1990s. They could sort of stick with a relationship with Russia, an economic and political relationship, or they could go west. You can look at the per capita income World Bank data for the countries that went west, that reformed immediately, went through the tough process. There's Poland. There's Estonia, 17,370, higher per capita income than Russia. Latvia, Lithuania. These countries 23 years ago were impoverished third world countries. They haven't quite reached Western European standard, but they've done pretty well after 23 years. Now, the nations that remained linked to Russia in their economy, security, and politics, hold a sec, there's Russia, even oil-rich Russia, 13,860, below the Baltics. Belarus, impoverished third world country, 6,000, and there's the Ukraine down there. What does Russia have to offer? Russia complained that these countries went to NATO, but NATO didn't force them to apply. Europe did not beg them to join. They made the decision to join because it was attractive for them to join NATO, to join the EU. On the other hand, what does Russia offer? Authoritarianism, oligarchy capitalism, suppression of human rights, poverty, and so forth. Here are three men that I worked for. These are the military chiefs of the Baltic states. By the way, the military chiefs and the defense ministers meet quarterly. I have a lot of my information I'm going to follow on with from this gentleman who alerted me that General Leonats, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Estonian Army, who has done some very interesting studies since he's retired on Russian media and propaganda. And by the way, I want to say that the commitment to the Baltics, of the Baltic states, to the West is very real. They have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, no caveats. They take casualties, and all of the soldiers that I know who have worked with them have high praise for the professionalism of the Baltic armies. Now let's talk about a very key part of the Russian and the Putin approach is soft power. And the doctrine, foreign policy doctrine of 2008 emphasizes soft power. It also emphasizes the use of information. And it's to support ethnic Russians, and it's to fight the Western concept of history. In other words, genuine critical history, to replace that with a Russian view, or Putin's view of history. And there's a very good article that was published. Read the Baltic Security Defense Review. It's a great journal. Very good article written on the Russian media on how the state media is direct descendants of the USSR, same people, just same changes. For the Russian side, you have a media approach that emphasizes disinformation and somewhat xenophobic Russian nationalism. NATO and seen as a US conspiracy. Everyone's in conspiracy against Russia. The Baltics are always portrayed as fascists and Nazis, and you'll see this, and ethnic Russians are oppressed. And something I find rather interesting is the rise of Tsarist symbology in Russia in the last decade. We have, there in all Russian official buildings, we have the double-headed Romanov eagle with the crown. And of course, the presidential guard are dressed in Tsarist-style uniforms. Now, Russia's new history, and the interesting part about the Russian new history is they have repudiated their earlier repudiation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The stand now, and the viewpoint now, the Russians are saying, is that the occupation of the Baltics was it was not an occupation. They voluntarily joined, and essentially they were, that Molotov-Ribbentrop didn't happen. In 1994, Putin, as a diplomat, was at a conference in Hamburg, and he walked out when the Estonian president used the word occupation. In 2005, they now deny that the Baltic republics were illegally occupied. And they have new laws and commissions to deal with the correct interpretation of history. And of course, all this is happening while academic freedom is suppressed. This is a key part of what I'm talking about, Project Russia, which is a group of Russian authors, but clearly endorsed by Putin, offering Putin's worldview. A series of 4 books given here, and this is the official, sort of the pseudo-official ideology of Russia. And by the way, a directive went out to all state employees that this is highly recommended that all state employees and military personnel read these books. Interesting from Project Russia, here are some of direct quotes from that. The West is corrupt. Democracy is a cancerous tumor. Monarchy is the ideal form of government. And very interesting. What Russia needs is a strong leader. Russians need a czar. Economic measures are not the only way to get the former Soviet republics back into the Russian fold. Russia must actively, creatively, resourcefully convince not only the politicians but the people. They're talking to the Russian ethnics and so forth. Now, the ultimate goal is set. The U.S. is a pretend global administrator. It should be Russia that should be the global administrator. I'm not making this stuff up. These are direct quotes. Okay, here's some, my wife, I am not, but my wife is a very fluent Russian speaker. In fact, we spent the last few years, we had 12 Russian channels on our television, 1 hour from Russia. Believe me, we've watched some Russian news. This is from the first volume, Project Russia. These direct quotes. The Great Schism produced Catholicism, capitalism produced atomism, the ultimate phase, development of fragmentation of society that leads to mass chaos. Russian legitimacy is based on the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox faith. Now, I find this absolutely ironic because, of course, this is written by the same people that destroyed thousands of churches and executed thousands of priests who are now claiming that the Russian Orthodoxy gives them their worldview legitimacy. Okay, what the Russian news media is like. My wife has translated the Russian state news media on the Malaysian airliner shoot-down. I'm not making this up. The Russians put it out. This is a CIA plot. They obtained the Malaysia airliner that had been secretly disappeared, and they filled it with dead bodies because they all had new passports. They proved this, and they blew it up over Ukrainian airspace. Quote, the purpose of the U.S. CIA operation as ever to blame Russia and initiate a large-scale civil war against it. Just quoting. Okay, this is a cartoon, again, Russian state media from February of this year. And it's about the U.S. ambassador arriving in Russia. And again, there's 2 kinds of media that the Russians have. They have the media that is shown to the Russian ethnic people, the ethnics outside of Russia and the Russian people, and then they have a very slick media presentation to the non-Russians. But here we have the Nazi flag and the NATO flag together in Latvia, 2004. typical, and by the way, I could show you a lot of examples where the Baltics are consistently portrayed by Nazis. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, Putin made a point about the rise of Nazism in Latvia. Then finally down to here, the ambassador arrives as a spy with electronic equipment, and that is the Russian middle finger. That's the critical commentary of the Russian state media. And here's another little bit from the Russian media, the Russian bear kicking the Americans out of the Ukraine. Now, the view of the Baltic leaders, and this is what was published last year in Security Perceptions, all of the Baltics are concerned about this kind of virulent nationalist campaign that is put out to the ethnic Russians in their countries. They have had to deal with this. This is nothing new. In the Baltics, there never was a reset. In 2007, the Estonians faced a nationwide cyber attack from Russia. This has been unrelenting the entire time I was in the Baltic states, the Russian propaganda media campaign against the Baltic. And they generously subsidized the Russian ethnic groups and political parties inside the Baltic states, looking as them. Some interesting views. Here's the deputy speaker of the Russian State Duma. The entire Baltics will either be occupied or destroyed, definitely, 2013. Baltics have noticed these things. Okay, the Russian defense plans. They have major defense reforms in place, new weaponry, new command and control, new training system, and as our army declines to 420,000 men, their army is planned to increase to 1 million men, and we'll have 2 brigades, very tiny force left in Europe. The military balance, clearly, in the future, if we stay on the same path, it shifts to Russia. Now the reset, well, first of all, the reset never happened. None of the Baltics that I interviewed, and again, I interviewed people, members of parliament, generals, and leaders, said that the reset ever meant anything. They all agreed that Russia is the big problem. They all have sort of a different variation of the national interest. The Lithuanians will talk about energy security, the Latvians about economy. But this is the consensus view, is that Russia is not cooperating in any meaningful way. And in fact, of course, Russian official doctrine of 2010, doctrine of the Russian Federation, lists NATO as the main enemy. One of the interesting issues is that the Baltics feel they need to convince the West that Russia is not a nice, benign power. One of my jobs in 2010, when they're getting ready for the big NATO new strategic concept, was to edit and develop workshops and papers for the Baltic ministers to take to NATO to argue the point that NATO needed to maintain its emphasis on Article 5 and territorial defense. Of course, in 2010, the Western Europeans and the Americans are all looking to NATO to help be a force for stability in the world and to help the environment, all these other things. And the Baltics, knowing that they need to be careful in dealing with the Americans, just wanted to get the one point across, and they succeeded. They did succeed in getting NATO to say that yes, territorial defense and Article 5 are still foundations of NATO. One Latvian academic told me, I think he put it very, very well, we don't want to be seen as just 3 countries that have unfriendly relations with Russia or cranky about Russia. So the Baltic states feel that they need to deal with the Americans, especially very carefully. By the way, they don't talk in security, they don't talk about the Europeans for the most part, because the core of NATO, as far as they're concerned, in the Western defense, is the alliance, the transatlantic alliance. That's the one you have with NATO. So here are the Baltics, some Baltic cartoons. They are nervous, but they are not panicked, because they've been dealing with this for a long time. Nobody in the Baltics thinks that the Russians are going to cross the border and invade them anytime soon. In fact, I would say they actually feel quite secure within NATO, even though all three Baltic countries are rapidly increasing their defenses. Last week, the Lithuanians announced they were increasing this year 30% defense increase. So, conclusion, reset was in the minds of our leaders. It was never reality. Reality is recognizing aggressive nationalist Russia. Russia, and as one Estonian general put it to me, James, when you're dealing with Russians, you cannot assume that you're dealing with rational people. There is an element, as you see from some of their media, that's somewhat irrational. And there's been a lot of discussion in the West, and I have heard certainly from Western academics, including some leaders, that the NATO expansion is the problem, and the NATO expansion forced Russia to react. I would disagree about 100% in that the NATO expansion, that you might be in a hot war right now in the Baltics, or the Baltics would likely have been attacked if they had not joined NATO. In this case, NATO expansion for the Baltics worked very, very well. In fact, here's something quite recent from the Daily Telegraph, an insert all paid for by the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, which is, again, the Russian media operations with Russian academics in English, very nicely studied. Of course, NATO is pressuring us, the NATO expansion, all very nicely laid out in nice terms about just how Russia is the victim of the West and so forth. Very slick English language campaign. Again, two campaigns, one to their own people, the other one very slick to the Western Europeans. I would argue key lessons are, we all keep saying we don't want to return to the Cold War, but I would say the Cold War strategies of deterrence and containment are still very good ideas in dealing with countries like Russia. I would argue that NATO and the US need to rearm. We need to maintain the European forces and quietly and firmly support reform and development in the Ukraine and Georgia and provide aid under requirements that they carry out the necessary military, economic, and social reforms. And finally, the last thing I would add is, having dealt with the media, is that our strategic communications in the West, in NATO, in the United States, are very, very weak. We are not answering this kind of the Russian propaganda media campaign, which is somewhat effective. And I would argue one of the final thing is that we need to rethink our approach and put a lot more resources, better organization into combating the information war, the media campaign that's carried out by Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Gabriela Marin Thornton, who is an instructional associate professor of international affairs here at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service. She has her PhD from the University of Miami and teaches classes on a variety of issues in international politics in theory and practice. She is, as a researcher, a specialist in democratization, political mobilization, and is currently engaged in a project on Romani identity in Europe today. She's given lectures all over the world and has received a number of awards both as a teacher and as a researcher. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Thornton.
Thank you very much, and I am very pleased to be here. I want to thank the organizer. I want to thank my colleagues that are here in the audience, my students. For those of you who do not know me, I don't want you to obsess about my accent. I was born and raised in Romania, so I'm Romanian originally. And again, welcome to this last talk that is mine. And the topic that I was asked to speak on by Andrew, I think is an extremely important topic. It's basically the link between Russia and the rise of right-wing parties in Europe. Now, I want to make it clear from the beginning that there is a link there, and the Russians are using right-wing parties in some cases, and by then I mean extreme right-wing parties. And I'm going to play for you a little YouTube video so you can see some of that talk in order to advance a certain political agenda. But I decided to proceed as following. First and foremost, I'm going to make my own introduction and try to bring our discussions here together. And what we're seeing here and we're hearing from all these panels, actually, it is what we more or less saw in the May issue, actually, of the Foreign Affairs, a debate between Russell Mead and Professor John Eikenberry. Mead had an article that was called The Return of Geopolitics, in which he argued that geopolitics is back, that we are dealing with revisionist states, such as Russia, China, Iran, revisionist states being defined as states that want to change the rules of the game. They want to change the system, a system that was created by the United States of America, a liberal international system also known as Pax Americana. Now, Mead wrote that, and Professor Eikenberry, who is a liberal internationalist, immediately replied. And he said, no. Russia is basically a basket case if you look inside. China has multiple problems, cannot challenge our global hegemony. Iran is not such a big player, so therefore our liberal international order, meaning our institutions, our market economies, our spreading of democracy, and our political system will survive even if the United States of America, as you well know right now, may not be the largest economy of the world anymore. Because our system is based on these good values. And therefore, you know, those countries may try to change the system, but they will be unsuccessful. So basically, we're dealing here with a question, is Russia capable of doing or changing, I would say, the system? Now, what I want to say, I think a little bit the debate in foreign affairs was not quite fair, let's put it like this, because a global power, if you look historically, does not necessarily fall all of a sudden, and is not necessarily challenged globally by one competitor. If you look at Great Britain, actually Great Britain was challenged regionally. In particular regions, Great Britain was challenged. So all of a sudden, the empire starts to crumble because there are too many regions and they cannot handle with it the problem of the imperial overstretch that we heard so much about talk. So this being the introduction, we're looking at revisionist Russia, a state that wants to change the system. If it is yes, I would say that then we're looking at a revisionist Russia that particularly would like to change the rules of the game in its neighborhood and in Europe. And after this introduction, I'm going to go to Europe and then link it to Russia. So Europe has a series of problems, security problems, particularly at its borders with Ukraine. The truth of the matter is that as much as we praise each other here, we couldn't help Ukraine, yeah? They lost Crimea, and maybe as we speak, or they already stopped, there are regional elections in Donetsk and Lugansk. And we can do anything. We don't do anything about it. That's one thing. The other thing is that we do see in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe parties that are extreme right-wing for the following reasons, more or less. It's not a complete list. First of all of you remember the economic crisis that hit the European Union in 2008. And then we saw a resurrection of right-wing parties. Then we do also remember, and we're seeing what is happening in the Middle East right now. And as much in the United States of America, it's talk about the dangers that the Middle East are posing to us. Basically, think about what is happening in the Middle East is at Europe's doors. And there are tons of immigrants that are trying from the Middle East to enter Europe. This is another reason for which you see the rise of this nationalist party. Another one, it's clearly, as you see in the press, in the Western press particularly, the migration of a population that is called the Roma or Gypsy from Eastern Europe towards Western Europe, and that creates a lot of problems, particularly Mr. Farage, the UKIP party, which is my favorite party, my students know that, who is highly nationalistic, is advocating basically going back onto the European integration and putting barriers back because he doesn't want migrants from Eastern Europe to enter the UK. Look, the Western world that we're talking about, it's in a lot of trouble. And what is Russia's role in that? What is Russia doing? Is it there any role into all that? Yes, it is. And the Russian idea here, it is that they can use these right-wing parties, in some cases could be left-wing parties, that they can use them in order to undermine the political system in Europe, and therefore install governments that are much more, that would be much more, let's say, favorable to Russia. This is basically the gist of the problem. Now, the Russians have a problem here, no question about. And their problem is that those parties are more or less marginal in some countries, so they didn't win too many seats. But in other countries, they are almost to take power. So let's go a big Western European country and look at the Front National and Marine Le Pen. They are coming on the third place. And if you look at the candidates for presidency right now in France, if an election will be today, Marine Le Pen will win. What she's campaigning on? Oh, no immigration, no EU, no transatlantic relation. Russia needs to come back and its rightful place in the security of Europe. It has a rightful place, and basically a new security will be built on an axis based on Paris, Berlin, and Moscow. Now, we kind of heard similar talk to Mr. Putin's predecessor in 2010 about rebuilding the security of Europe and taking Russia in consideration in that. One thing I want to tell you, as much as we want to make the Russians into the devils, they are players in Europe, and they want to make it clear that they are players and they will stay as players. And what you see right now, okay, they have our propaganda, we have ours, they are irrational, they are bad, they are crazy. Now what you see right now, Russian planes flowing through over the Baltic states, over the Baltic Sea, into the Swedish space, into the Norwegian space, over the Black Sea, altogether. Those are basically actions that Russia is resurrecting to tell everybody, I'm here to stay. I'm part of the European security. So how these things will evolve, I don't have a crystal globe here to tell you, but I think I'm gonna right now start and give you a vision of what is going on in certain European states as much as I can, and who's approaching Russia in those states and how. So I'm gonna go to Hungary third party in rank, the Jobbik party. Actually, when I go to Hungary, I have to go basically to the first party, Fidesz party. Mr. Orban is actually a big supporter of Russia. And we all remember, oh, Hungary, the poster child of transition towards democracy. The best transition, a reforma pactata. Hungary right now basically said that if the case may be, they can leave the European Union. They will collaborate with Russia. And actually their rhetoric, the rhetoric of their right-wing party, it is appalling. It is an anti-Jewish rhetoric. It is actually a pro-Nazi rhetoric. It is an anti-Roma, anti-Gypsy rhetoric they are building on. And of course, it's anti-Brussels, anti-American, no question about. And you hear that all over in Hungary. And I want to play a clip, Michael, if it's going to help me here, in which you're going to see a Jobbik rally. So this party is in the third place in Hungary. It's just a minute. They will give you an idea what kind of rhetoric is coming from some Eastern European countries. If we can play that clip.
Everyone has an off day. Surprisingly, an Allstate agent can help. With accident forgiveness, they can make sure your rates don't go up just because of an accident. The good hands are doing more than ever before.
A gátlástalan cionista nyomulással szemben egyedül az erő felmutatása hatásos. A cionizmus hódoltsági területe, a cionizmus kiszemelt gyarmata, ahol nekünk, benszülötteknek legfeljebb statiszta szerepet szánnak.
Emlékszem, volt egy puskád, hoztad a térre, s én vártam rád, a piros fehér zöld karszalagok.
Adjon az Isten! Különlegesek vagyunk mi itt Európában. De nem azért, mert mi vagyunk a legantiszemitább nép, hanem azért, mert ha akár egész Európa is az ő lábuk előtt fog heverni, ha akár egész Európa az ő lábukat fogja nyalni, mi akkor sem fogjuk. Az izraeli honfoglalóknak, befektetőknek, térfoglalóknak, térhódítóknak keresniük kellene valamelyik másik részén a világnak célországot, mert Magyarország nem eladó.
Again, what I'm showing you here when it comes to Hungary is not a marginal party. It's a party very close to the Russians. And again, in Hungary, we don't even need this party because the Fidesz party, which is the ruling party, is very, very close to Russia's model, to much more authoritarianism, took a lot from the freedom of the Hungarian people. And look, it got elected. So now we can move from Hungary a little bit, and we can move at a party called Ataka in Bulgaria, which is financed actually by the Russians. It's coming strong. And together with the Jobbik party and with the Golden Dawn in Greece, which I'll be talking about, the three parties actually went to supervise the elections in Crimea and recognize them as legitimate. It's very interesting. So we have different parties in the same country recognizing or not elections in Crimea. Now I'm going to move a little bit to the Romanian elections that took place just yesterday. We're going to have a second tour in that. And we see actually the proto-communist, much more leftist party on the run. And I'm pretty sure they are going to win. Now, this is not a marginal party. It's a main party. It's going to be a leftist party that already declared the following, and its followers actually are many, many in Romania, that basically the Americans are great. They are wonderful. The Black Sea rotational force right now, it is in Romania conducting exercises, but they are over there. And you saw what happened in Ukraine. And Mr. Putin is kind of over here. And we think he's irrational. He talks the talks, he walks the walk. So you better, guys, think about. So those are ideas that are floating there in Eastern Europe, and they are taking root. And it's not just talk, or one person told me, or the other person told me. We see that in the elections. We see that those people elect those parties. Now, I'm going to move a little bit to the Golden Dawn that I'm sure most of you have been reading in the press. Is a very right-wing party in Greece, does not have a lot of support because Syriza, the left-wing party, actually has a lot of support. But the Golden Dawn party, whose members keep being jailed and keep being out, keep being killed, or they keep killing others, actually it's a party that is extremely pro-Russian, founded by, as we believe, by the Russians, and they declare basically that they want to bring back Greece to its nationalistic roots and have the Russians defend their energy roots. They do not, the rhetoric, it's anti-European that's coming from there, it's anti-American, and it's anti-German in the case of Greece particularly. We do have a list of long party, like the Freedom Party in Austria, that is blaming the European crisis on the liberalization model that the United States of America has spread and Brussels implemented in the European Union. We have the Flemish National Party for a long time that actually is a very nationalistic party and very close to the Russian. We have the Lega Nord in Italy, which is sponsored by the Russian and is gaining terrain. It's a right-wing party. And we have the Swedish Democratic Party, believe it or not, that basically, I believe, won about 13% of the election, which is a party, again, anti-immigration, anti-EU, anti-liberalization, and didn't win so much support. We had other developments in Sweden that actually were good. I don't want to make Sweden look too black because it's not one of the blackest countries in Europe, but the whole idea is that those parties are the ones that are basically collaborating with Russia, and Mr. Putin is financing as much as he can those parties. It's undermining from inside. Look, what the planes will do or what the military will do, it is one thing. But the changing of a system comes in time. And already the Russians started to get in touch, to have a lot of influence in Europe. And basically, we had a conference at the Bush School, and I don't remember the year, but it was put in by the National Intelligence Council, and it was called Global Trends 2020. And of course, they were talking about global warming and the fact that if that phenomena happens, Russia is going to be a big winner in global warming and because of the phenomena of global warming. But that report ended, of course, in the hands of the Europeans. And Europeans noticed one thing, that actually in America's Global Trends 2020, Europe was nowhere. And we're talking about Middle East, China rise, Russia. Europe was basically nowhere. Was considered a pacified region with absolutely no problems. At that particular point, and I hate to use what one person said and say this is what it is, but that's very true that at that particular point, the intelligence chief of the Romanian services talked to me, and he had the report on his table, and he said, "Where is Europe here?" And I said, "What are you afraid of?" And he said, "I'm afraid of the Russian undermining the political and economic system of Eastern Europe, and nobody in America seems to get it." So, in short, basically, this is my story, and this is my argument. If we move to NATO, basically, yes, those parties are not so enamored with NATO, and I believe they kind of subscribe to Russia's demands that NATO is not going to be, should not be further enlarging. Now, let me say this. From our perspective, NATO has brought prosperity and stability in Eastern Europe. That's no question about it. From Russians' perspective, NATO moved into territories that they had influence over it. Unless Russia could have been brought into our international order, it was clear that the Russians will stand up, will have something to say about what's going on in that part of the world. The advancement of NATO into Eastern Europe was made possible in the years in which Russia was very weak. Like 2004, when the Baltics and others joined, or 2007, when Bulgaria and Romania finally joined. However, Russia, when Mr. Putin came, became a different story. So Mr. Putin, in a way, changed the game. So the idea in 2010 that somehow we could have pushed NATO into Ukraine, I think it was a very dangerous idea. And look, people are, I am one that I like to talk about identity, very much so. But I will want to make a thing clear. Identity is something that is very hard to define. It's in flux, it's changing, and there is a lot of discussion about how the Russians perceive the Ukrainians. And you can call them crazy, that makes no difference. Basically, they think that those territories are theirs. This is period. This is what they believe, this is what they think, and we see what happened. So I think in a way we need to deal with a lot of realities. On the other hand, yes, I think Russia internally has a lot of problems. They may not be able to sustain the armament, and that's gonna get them in a situation like at the end of the Cold War, in which basically because of an arm race, we ran them into the ground. Their economy was not working. They had to build missiles, so they had to basically starve their population. And it was 1971, actually, when the economists were telling the political scientists, the historians, the IR scholars, you know what? Russia is going to collapse. It's not working. It's not producing anything. And everybody was like, no, 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 no. It's that big bear that is going to be there forever. So economic conditions, I believe, in Russia are very important and will further probably determine Russia's strategies in Europe and in its neighborhood altogether. With that being said, let me see if I have prepared anything for you. Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'm gonna give, you know, I'm gonna finish and then let you ask questions about what brought into being again, I wanna make it clear, those right-wing parties in Europe. And first, I mentioned the Euro crisis, and when conditions are bad, people tend to become anti-migrant. So a flux of economic conditions are bad, and all of a sudden you get a flux of immigrants coming into, so that basically makes it worse. Also, we talk right now about basically the inexistence of a young generation that remembers World War II. I mean, that generation in Europe is gone, that was much closer to America, that remember the Marshall Plan, that remember what America built, that generation is gone. The young generation does not have any kind of memory of that, so that's a factor too. And the other factor that actually acts and plays right into the hands of those parties is basically are the forces of globalization that we praise in the United States of America. Actually, we see that globalization gave rise, backlash to, it's a backlash. Nationalism comes as a backlash to globalizations. So all these factors right now are coming together in Europe. Brussels is weak because of the economic crisis. NATO did not deliver anything in Ukraine, not that Ukraine is a NATO member and NATO had any obligation. But certainly the border right now is questioning. But if an attack is going to take place, is NATO going to defend us? Is Article 5, you know, something that we can rely on? Or maybe we can change our policy, look at the Polish are trying to reach to the Russians and open a conversation. And that is actually a policy of neighborhood. They understand that they have to live with the Russians. The United States of America, it is far. The idea of placing new military forces in the United States of America, I mean, in Europe, in order to defend Europe, I mean, I'm more than happy to have them there. The question is that who's going to pay? How are we going to pay for that? And how many forces do we need? And look at our budget and look at the problems that we have internally. Do we want to run ourselves into the ground? So those are actually questions that are open right there and will stay. I want to make some observations also in terms of identity. Yes, the Russians are calling the opposition in Ukraine Nazi, and they are calling some of the Baltics Nazi countries. Now, look, I think we all remember that, or know, that Hungary, Romania, and the Baltics were countries that collaborated with the Nazi then. I mean, that's nothing to put under the rug. There were Jewish that were killed, that were deported, and also we all remember then when the Baltic states actually prepare for the joining of the European Union, they put some laws in there. It was quite impossible for the Russian minority to pass the exam, language laws. People in their 60s and 70s didn't know how to speak Estonian. They had no way of getting a passport. They basically became countryless. Now, I don't call this a perfect democracy at all, and I understand that Russians would not be happy with that. I fully do. That being said, what I'm afraid that we are seeing collectively in Europe, it's actually a move towards more authoritarian regime. We're seeing in the transitions that took place in Eastern Europe a backslide. And that is not a good thing, and it's playing exactly into Mr. Putin's hands. What is going to save, in a way, Europe if Russia goes bankrupt economically? Otherwise, Russia is there to stay and make it clear it's going to be a player. And we're going to have in America to renegotiate this proposition. And for the moment, I don't have a bullet, you know, a crystal globe to tell you how this should be renegotiated. One thing I have to say, in a way, indeed the Russian propaganda is terrible, but we better stop vilifying them too and find a solution, something. And Ukraine doesn't make it easy, no question about. And it's very hard to know what's happening in Ukraine. I'm not going to make any generalization. It's going to take 2 years, 3 years, 10 years till we will see documents and we will understand who killed who in Ukraine. Like we look right now at Bosnia-Herzegovina and try to understand, because the documents are online, who killed who, clearly. And it took quite a while. So I will urge you to just take a step back and wait, because we're going to have some time till, it's going to pass some time till we will know exactly what happened in Ukraine. With that being said, I thank you very much, and I thank you, the organizers, and that's it.
I want to thank our panelists for some really interesting conversation, and I'm hoping that that we can have some more conversation, a back and forth with the audience through the Q&A. I do want to take another chair's prerogative and perhaps lead with a thought and a question. One of the really remarkable themes that I've heard over the last hour and a half with our three panelists is really that you know, we've used the word propaganda a lot, and in fact, what we have here are a series of contending narratives. That the Russian, if we're going to call it the Russian narrative of the last, not just the last 25 years, but the last 70 years since the end of the Second World War, the last 75 years since the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact, these are powerful historical narratives, and to count them out as mere propaganda is, I think, a problem. And the fact of the matter is that the Brussels narrative, the narrative of a Europe gradually, peacefully coming together in the interests of burying old grievances and healing old wounds, has lost a great deal of its punch in the last 7 or 8 years as the world has reeled from a series of financial crises. So thinking about this in terms of narratives is, I think, a very powerful tool for thinking about what Putin's Russia means in today's Europe. It is, in fact, I think, remarkable, and this leads me to my question for the panel, how few times Brussels has come up in this discussion, and very much related to that. I think it's a commonplace when we think about Europe today, when we think about Europe's response to Russia, that whatever Europe does, to the extent that Europe does anything, Germany is going to play a critical role in that, and I don't think we've really mentioned Germany at all in the last hour and a half. And as someone who studies Germany for a living, that's really worrisome. So I would ask the panelists if we could consider it, if this is germane to what you think or what you're arguing. What are the drivers of Europe's response to Putin's Russia? What are the chances that the current sanctions regime will deepen, or that they'll be continued, or that in the end this will prove to be a compromise that in the end accomplishes very little? So I would throw this to our panel, and then after they've finished answering, then I'll open the floor to the audience.
Well, start with as far as Germany goes, the Germans are very reluctant to do anything, and that is because they have gas deals, oil deals with the Russians. The Russians hold a very, very strong hand as far as their oil, as the gas and the oil supplies, and Western Europe and Eastern Europe, to a large degree, is dependent on Russian supplies, and that is going to limit any sanctions or whatever. As far as military things, it's, and I can say this from the viewpoint of operating within NATO countries, Germany is not one of your really reliable NATO partners, simply because the pacifist ideology is so strong in Germany. When they commit troops, it's always as a symbolic act. They put them in Somalia when they went in the 1990s. They stayed in their compound because politically they can't take losses. In Afghanistan, they put them in a safe place. They avoided patrolling, avoided any fighting, leaving that to countries like the Danes and the Dutch that did serious fighting. So the Germans are really on the outs in NATO right now as far as military things, and because you know, and this is not the German military that is very good and professional, their government when it comes, for the last 20-something years, when it comes to any issue of using force, you cannot rely on the Germans. By the way, thank God the Poles have joined NATO because they have a very, one of the larger, most capable armies in Europe. But I do see that there is, it's a different, the new Europe and old Europe it's quite true. The tendency in the old NATO countries in 2010, when we were developing the NATO strategic concept, was about global warming and getting friendly with Russia. And the Eastern Europeans, all of whom knew the Russians very well, kept emphasizing territorial defense. And we mounted a major lobbying campaign to make sure that got in. But we were very worried about the Germans being very wishy-washy on such deal. This is the reality. And in any issue that comes to deal with security, the European Union is not even a factor. The diplomats love to talk about European Union and security, but it's been a dream since before I was born. The reality is there is one security organization that works in Europe, and that's NATO.
Answer to your question is very simple. European Union is not designed to address this kind of challenges. And the project of European Union was successful only because there was an organization called NATO, and there was a country called United States that provided not only money, but also security umbrella. And we cannot expect from EU what it by default cannot deliver. The fact that it has a telephone number that you can call to doesn't mean that it's a country that can act like United States can act. It cannot. Second, I would respectfully disagree that the European narrative disappeared. And the vivid manifestation of that is what happened on Maidan. And probably that's the first time that people died for European idea and European flag, under the European flag. So I would not say that it's not a compelling factor for countries of those countries in Eastern Europe that did not yet join the EU or European institutions. It's very much still there. So it's not that people don't want to be closer to Europe, part of the Europe, or somehow associated with Europe, but there is one guy who is saying you cannot do it, you don't have a right to make your own decisions. I'm the one who is going to dictate to you what you're going to do, and that's what people around Russia do not like. I have to say something, with all due respect, what do you mean that you don't know who kills who in Ukraine?
What do I mean, what?
That it's not clear who kills who in Ukraine. I think it's very clear who kills who started, who paid for it, and of course it started by Ukrainians killing Ukrainians because some guy called Yanukovych received a couple of billions of dollars for that. And I don't think that, I happen to know a little bit more than usual ambassadors about military equipment because I was in a country that was at war with Russia. I mean, nobody can convince me that some kind of insurgency can handle, S-200 missile systems that shut down the airplane. And I can go on that, but I wanted to hear from you, what do you mean it's unclear who is killing who?
I think the controversy started basically when in November the protester came, after President Yanukovych refused to sign the EU agreement with Europe, as you know. And at that particular point, the Maidan people came together, and at that particular point, we saw a lot of narrative about democracy, about getting out of the Russian sphere, getting integrated into the European Union, and things were great. Now, from there, what I accept is that actually Yanukovych committed a mistake by trying in killing some of the protesters.
No, it's not a mistake, it's crime.
It's a crime. Mistakes from for a president point of view, but it's a crime, killing people. I agree with them, with you. Now, from there, I am not sure what happened because you know how revolutions are. People with good intention come into the squares, and they will promote a certain ideology, and they have the best intentions. The question is, who fights further? And I'm coming from a country that actually had the bloodiest and only bloodiest revolution in Eastern Europe, Romania, in which 3,000 people died. And after 25 years, we do not know who killed them. But what I'm saying, there are a lot of Ukrainian scholars coming right now with basically what they call proof. I don't know if it's a proof. I said we need to wait on that, that actually on the Maidan, there were snipers that were prepared by the Svoboda, that didn't even make it right now in the parliament, you know, the right wings. And basically those people started, in a way, provoked all the things. Now that may be a conspiracy theory or not, but I'm telling you, it's there in the academic world. There are serious scholars that are looking at it, and I prefer to wait. I do not want to take away from the aspiration of the Ukrainian people. They were in the square, really wanting an association agreement with the EU, really wanted to be part of the EU. But as far as the killings are going, I think my first idea is going to become so confusing, like Bucharest, and it's going to become he shoot it, they shoot it, we shoot it, nobody knows who shoot it.
Okay, may I comment a little bit, Mr. Chairman?
Let's briefly, and then let's throw it back to the audience.
Number one, I don't remember anybody on Maidan saying that we want to drift away from Russia. They were not saying that we don't want to be in the Russian sphere of influence. They just said we want association agreement with Europe because those countries, as we've seen in your presentations included, are better off dealing with Europe, being in the European group of family, and Ukrainians believe that they are Europeans. So they said that, you know, we are here not to be against Russia, but to be for something. That's number one. Number two, I'm excessively suspicious of those who are talking about conspiracy theories. They are well documented, not only stories, but facts, who was shooting, who were snipers, and what was happening there. And we also happen to know how FSB officers penetrated so-called opposition parties, and there were constant meetings and things like that. I think that's very clear who took Crimea. I think it's very clear who were these so-called polite green men. I think it's very clear whose soldiers died on the Ukrainian territory. Soldiers, I'm not talking about irregulars, about mercenaries or Chechens or volunteers. Professional soldiers. That the Russian organization, Mother of Soldiers, already counted more than 4,000. Who is shooting who on Ukrainian territory? How happens that Russian soldiers are dying on Ukrainian territory? I think there are cases when things are black and white, and every attempt of Russian special forces to blur the picture should not excite us, because that's what they want. Sorry.
I think I can definitively say we won't prove anything today, and we will throw this open to the audience. Thanks to both of you for those comments. Yes, please, Alexa. Sure.
I can show you photographs where they're carrying weapons that are only issued to
all right. My name is Alexei Ilyin, Bush School of Government and Public Service, and I would like to ask 2 questions, if you don't mind. First question is for Ambassador Yakobashvili. Well, first of all, I would like to make a remark. So I honestly do not understand where do you get your numbers and your statistics, because you say that 4,000 Russian soldiers died secretly in Ukrainian land. And as far as I know, the death toll of the conflict has just reached 4,000. And are all these 4,000 Russian soldiers? Or Don't understand. Second, as far as I know, in Chechnya, the death toll, well, official Russian statistics say 20,000. Unofficial, or some Western sources say 30 or 40, you say 150. Don't understand. And now to the question. You mentioned that here in Bush School, we should remember that George Bush was the author, the creator of post-Cold War order in post-Soviet space, which preserved peace and stability for a long period, and now we should, and now this order is being eroded, and probably you presume it's been eroded by Russia. But we have to remember what was that kind of Bush order. There was unwritten consensus, unwritten agreement between Bush and Gorbachev that after the collapse of the socialist bloc in Eastern Europe, after reunification of Germany, NATO would not expand to the east. It didn't hold, it was broken. Later there was another unwritten agreement between Bush Jr. and Putin several times announced that if NATO would expect to Russian neighborhood, Ukraine and Georgia, that the peace will be broken. This consensus was also not honored. So we know, you say that Russian neighborhood should be empowered and Russian government should be changed to a better one, the one that you assume we deserve. But what does it presume? That so-called coward revolution should be financed in Moscow, and NATO and the United States should further help Georgia and Ukraine to be integrated to NATO. We know how it ended up in 2008 with Georgia and 2013 with Ukraine. So do you really believe it's going to end up in peace this time? How can you preserve peace with that plan? And what will end from peace? Will be any peace? I mean, if you tighten the loop on Mr. Putin's neck, he's going to fight back and he's going to fight harder. Do you take it into account?
First, my sources. My sources are coming from Russia, and not hidden sources, but you have to go and visit the website of the Russian organization called the Union of the Mothers of Soldiers. And it's all there. And 4,000 that is UN is referring to civilians, and I never said that as they are civilians. I'm talking about militaries. And the 4,000 civilians died in the conflict. That's a big difference. Second, on Chechen, go to any sources that are reliable, not the Russian sources, reliable sources of Chechen diasporas, and they will give you a list with names, not just figures, but they will give you names of those people who died in that conflict, directly killed or died because of the conflict, and there are 150,000. Now, when I said Bush order, I said worldwide and not only the post-Soviet space. The order was based on international system when the US, by the way, together with Europeans and Russians, signed with Ukraine. And unfortunately, neither the US or the Europeans are keeping their promise when Ukrainians gave up their military weapons. One can claim that it would not function. They would make it functional if necessary. So what is the signal that the world is receiving, that if you have a nuclear power or nuclear capability, you better stick with it, because there is no guarantee that anybody in the world can give you that you will not be invaded. And that's the document that Russia itself signed. And when I'm talking about order is the respect, is the basics of international system, I believe you as a student here know at least that much, that international system is based on rules, and one of the basic rules is the integrity of the borders and unviolability of the borders, and you cannot change it by force. Now, when it goes to the changes in Russia and around Russia, it's Georgian decision to join whatever the Georgians want to join. It cannot be up to somebody else they like or don't like. Population of Georgia, Ukraine, whoever, have to have a choice, a free choice, to join whatever they want. They want to join NATO. It's up to them and NATO to negotiate. And it's up to them and Europeans to negotiate. And it should not be in the hands of somebody else, the third party, who will say, oh, by the way, I don't like it. Second, this mythology was not even once but million times refuted that there was no promise made by any Bushes, father or kid, to any Soviet or Russian leader that NATO will not expand, and it's a fiction. And what I know from the first sources, Putin told to President Bush that if you are going to do Kosovo, then there will be troubles in Ukraine and in Georgia. That's true, but it's not that Bush said, okay. There was no promise. There was nothing. On the contrary, I think that when NATO was expanding, Russia was given something that should not be given, in my understanding, but people thought that it would make more sense to give the seat in the G7, the G8, a NATO-Russia Council, showing that, we are not going to employ anything against you. Promise that now will be violated not to base any extra forces on the newly joined countries, and that was there, but now it will be revised because of the Russian actions. And why you think that somebody should finance you anything inside your country to be liberated? Why it's not in the hands of the Russians themselves? I know that, how it's sold in Russia that all these colored revolutions, there was some kind of Tory and Nuland distributing some cookies, and we were getting so excited with the cookies that staged revolutions. But, come on. It's up to you to choose your leadership, and it's up to you to consume as much freedom as you want. It's not up to Georgians and not up to Americans or anybody else. But you also have to respect the choice of your neighbors, what they want to join and whom they want to join. And there is no sane Georgian who is opposing, good relations with Russia. But what you get now is, and it's a very interesting factor that when Huntington was writing about Clash of Civilizations, now we see not Clash of Civilizations, but clash within the civilizations when Orthodox Russia is occupying territories of Orthodox Georgia and Orthodox Ukraine. That's very strange. And in the same time, you are getting now 40 million Ukrainians who hate you, literally. And I'm not exaggerating. And it's a tragedy of Russia. And I'm not talking ethnic Ukrainians or from, the Galicia and others. I'm talking Russian-speaking Ukrainians, ethnic Russians who hate Putin's Russia and Putinism. And you think that you can survive in that kind of environment? You put entire neighborhood into fire and you are warming your hands and say, wow, that's so nice. It's not going to happen. So nobody needs to finance anything in Russia. You stand up, and you and the generation as educated people have to start understanding something's broken in the way that your leadership is conducting international affairs. And instead of arguing with me the lies that you were fed, it's better to get hand with some other Russian colleagues and think about your country, not about my country.
I want to add just a little bit, Alexei, here and say, and fully agree, this is a myth. This is a myth that somebody promised that NATO is not going to enlarge. Nobody promised anything. So it's a myth. I didn't see any document. If you have a document that will show such
no, it was allegedly, it was,
yeah, it was allegedly a conversation that might have been there. But I did not see any document that will promise that. And again, what we see is one voice, that of the liberal order. People will have the right to determine their regime, to join the organization that they want. And from this point of view, Alexei, Russia seems to be a revisionist state.
Jim wanted to get...
Well, first of all, the whole issue about that it was NATO expansion that pushed the poor Russians is one of the most successful examples of disinformation and how effective this has been among the Western elites. Who've, here's the Foreign Affairs, September, October, Mearsheimer's article. It's how the West provoked Putin. Now, first of all, there's the simple fact that in all of these negotiations that led to signed and ratified treaties, that Russia was paid a lot of money to move its military forces and relocate them in the East. Russia was given interest-free loans. It was given grants. In other words, the Russians took the money. And in our culture, at least, when you sign a treaty and you take the money, later on, 20 years later, to complain that, well, we didn't get a good deal is rather strange. And then the idea that signed, ratified treaties, which the Russians violate, I think they've violated repeatedly, the signed and ratified, including the arms control agreements recently, signed, ratified treaties should be overridden by informal after-dinner conversations by government ministers and diplomats. And I can only think of things like, through these are usually vodka-fueled after-dinner discussions. So I can think we'd have the Smirnov Agreement or the Stolnichaya Accords, replacing Stolnichaya Accords, replacing signed, ratified agreements. But the Russian disinformation is fantastic. They're very, very good at it. And like I said, they run 2 campaigns. Here it is, Daily Telegraph, New York Times inserts, well-written, done in English, appealing to the Western themes, and then to their own people and to the ethnic Russians, these xenophobic nationalist campaigns. So we have that interesting mix. But yes, this is an utter myth and easily refutable. But like really bad ideas that get out in the academic community, they will continue, especially in the Ivy Leagues, for the next decade.
Hello, my name is Miguel. I'm also a Bush School student. Thank you so much for your intervention. My question is really specific. It's actually a counterfactual situation, but do you think that a different international response to the incident in Georgia in 2008 would have changed the current situation in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea?
Very short answer is absolutely yes. Because Russians were testing the ground in Georgia. And then when we said that it's a first bird and you are going to see more, and I can show you a video of Georgian former President Saakashvili literally predicting the next will be Ukraine. That time, Ukrainian leadership and leadership in the Eastern Europe understood it very well. That's why all of these leaders came to Georgia during the war. And Lithuanian foreign minister was asking for foldable bed. He said there was an information they're going to bomb the governmental compounds. They said, I will sleep here, let them bomb me. Estonian president saying, I'm staying here, let them bomb the leader of the neighboring country, not really neighboring, but. So that was a solidarity, not only for the sake of Georgia, but these people understanding that they are the next. When Ukrainians were told, don't overreact on Crimea, it reminded me France and Britain telling to Poles that don't mobilize your forces because you are going to provoke Hitler. After Hitler invaded Poland, they said, why you did not mobilize your forces? So, and I told to Ukrainians, if you are naive to understand, to believe that Russia is going to stop on the Crimea and the Krim Nash and everybody is happy and everything is fine, it's not going to happen. And look what is happening now. We are getting yet another so-called frozen conflicts. All of that will be backfired. I mean, Russia already has Moldova on its borders. Now there's Ukraine on its borders. Crimea is occupied. 2 territories of Georgia occupied. The Nagorno-Karabakh is still there, the frozen conflict. This is the environment that's going to be somehow good for Russia? I don't understand that. But the problem there is that, what I mentioned before, that Putin is not the patriot of this Russia. For him, Stalin was a hero because he was not the patriot of Russia either. Even he was ethnic Georgian, he was killing more Georgians than anybody else. And there is a tendency in the world that Morsi, what was wrong with Morsi in Egypt? Because Morsi was not the Egyptian patriot, he was the head of international NGO, Muslim Brotherhood. For him, Egypt was not that important. The same way, Russia for Putin is not that important. For him, some bigger thing is more important. So don't expect the rational statehood behavior from the guy that doesn't really believe in that territory as a country.
Alex.
Thank you. Alexander Tansky, PhD student from Ukraine. Well, we talk quite a lot about Russia and European Union, or at least Brussels point of view. But I would like to come back to, I think it was middle of 90s when Budapest Treaty was signed, that Ukraine exchanged the third largest nuclear weapon arsenal in exchange of guarantees from 3 countries, including United States and United Kingdom, in exchange of sovereignty of Ukrainian borders. Well, I guess with recognition of Crimea as part of Russian Federation, everybody knows that it's kind of time to help. So what prevents United States and UK from doing something what they promised? Thank you.
Because American president said to Putin, give me more time after elections, and I'll be more flexible, and he's more flexible. He's keeping his word. So anybody else is looking at America, what Americans will do. If Americans are not willing to do anything, don't expect anybody else to do something. That's a very simple, honest, and brutal answer.
Yes, but let me say, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that memorandum was signed by UK, by the United States of America, and by Russia, guaranteeing actually the borders of Ukraine. Now, Russia is in violation of that. But the question is, aren't we in violation too? Are we or are we not? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. But we signed, we guaranteed for those people their territory, for Ukrainians, their territorial integrity. We did not deliver. That's the way I see it, but maybe it's just me. But I think there are lots of Ukrainians that are seeing that, like the United States of America did not deliver. I mean, this is simple. It's as simple as that. And we had a lot of Americans working in that denuclearization of Ukraine, in moving. I mean, and Ambassador Napper is here. And I mean, we had a lot of great people trying to do that, and all of a sudden, you know, the country falls apart. And I think we should have done something. We signed that memorandum, but we didn't do anything.
Hopefully the new administration, whoever will be, will do something.
I have a question for the ambassador, if I might. I've been seeing some reporting that the new Georgian government, the Georgian Dream government, has begun at least reached some preliminary agreements with the Russian Federation. I understand there's now a direct flights between Tbilisi and Moscow, and there's some talk of ending some of the trade sanctions. Do you see that going anywhere, or is this, what would be your evaluation of their efforts to try to at least get something done in the relationship?
I've dealt with my Russian colleagues in varieties of capacity, as a minister, as a think tanker, as an ambassador, as a regular citizen, and all the time I came across some very interesting methodology from Russians. In Russian it's called the "Polovina nam, polovina мне," which means if we are dividing something, their approach is half is mine, another half is ours. Okay, not yours, but half is mine, and another half, let's negotiate, it's ours. How much you are going to get, it's a big question. So first of all, restoring the normal flights it's coming back to normality from abnormality, not improving something. If you are not having a direct flight with your neighboring country, it's abnormal. The reality was that there were flights, but they were all called charter flights. So now they just changed the name. So for me, charter, non-charter, doesn't really matter. Okay? I have to admit that economic embargo actually helped us enormously because we were forced to diversify our markets for Georgian wine, to produce much better wine that we did, and to look at the other markets in Europe, in Asia, and we did it. And now we are sliding back into the very unpredictable market. I don't like it. So the Georgian dream is not my dream, not as for ambassador of that previous government and member of the cabinet, but for many other reasons. There is no sane person in Georgia who doesn't want to improve relationship with Russia, but not on the cost of our territorial integrity and sovereignty, not on the cost of our freedom. And that's what people in Russia have to understand, that countries can be small or big, but they have their own interests. And when European countries understood it, they have more than 50 years of prosperity. And Russia was treated in the same way as the same John Eikenberry was writing in his book After Victory, that when you win, you should not really alienate the loser, you have to integrate it into bigger picture, and people really tried to integrate Russia. Even now there are some naive people that believe that it's still possible with this government, but intention of the West was never to humiliate Russia, but was to get them back into Western institutions. I'll give you more examples. We were, our hands were twisted to allow Russia in WTO. First thing that Russia did when they entered the WTO, they broke the rules. I know so many people who are advocating for Russia being part of a Council of Europe. Now they are kind of pariahs in the Council of Europe. They don't feel even comfortable sitting there, and their delegation is not welcomed anymore, by the way, in the Council of Europe. So it's not that institutions by themselves going to change their behavior. It should be upon the changing the neighborhood, not allowing them to brainwash you, and helping Russians themselves. And escape the question.
Thanks. Phil Brooks, Army War College fellow here at the Bush School for a year. I just returned from Afghanistan March and had the privilege of leading some soldiers from the Czech Republic, and the Jordans were coming in. You mentioned the Army is getting smaller in Europe, but as you know, the Army now has an operating concept of regionally aligned forces. And as of today, they're actually conducting security cooperation in the Baltic states that were discussed previously, and persistently engaging those countries, building that cooperation. Just interested on hearing your thoughts on how we, the U.S., can leverage enablers such as that to enhance our foreign policy in those countries as it relates to the topic of discussion today in Russia.
Well, if the U.S. wants the Europeans to do more, the waiting for the Europeans to go first won't work. Basically, the only way that the Europeans, the Western Europeans in particular, will really make the necessary increases or improvements in their defense capabilities is if the U.S. takes the first step. And right now, given the world security situations that we face, and Iran and China, Russia, everything, cutting the U.S. Army to 420,000 men is absurd. I can't see it. The Navy is being cut. The Air Force next year is losing 500 aircraft. The Navy is losing 20,000 personnel. I cannot see that if it comes to a crisis situation, that the U.S. will, after having given up missile defense in Europe, leaving the Europeans, I think, defenseless against Iran when, not if, when Iran gets the bomb. I don't think that either Russia or Iran is impressed when the U.S. comes up and says, you know, if you don't cooperate with us on defense issues, we're going to cut 2 more carrier battle groups, or we'll eliminate 3 more brigades. That'll show you. I don't see in these authoritarian states respect military force. The old Soviet Union respected numbers and military force. You can do all this diplomacy, you can have the nicest stuff. Economics is important, but having military capability, and we are losing that, having real military capability must be on the table if we're going to get an agreement. I think the only way to keep stability in Europe is with military force. And I'm reflecting a Baltic viewpoint. The stronger we are in Europe and when we maintain there, and I would like to see American forces, army forces, let's say, deployed to Poland. I think that would be a very good place because the Polish have divisions. They have large forces that would make a considerable military force that could be reckoned with. I think given Kaliningrad and the very strong Baltic naval base, I think we should have naval forces in the Baltic and base them in the Baltic states. I think that would be the most effective deterrent. I think that our policy for the last 6 years has been completely wrong, and it is leading to, I think, a greater destabilization than if we had maintained I think a stronger force. As I said, NATO expansion has been great for the security of European countries. And if NATO hadn't gone, if the Baltics had not been allowed to join NATO, as some maintained was a bad idea, I think they would be under serious threat of invasion right now. But right now, the Baltics do not feel that they're seriously going to be invaded. They're still increasing their armed forces dramatically, but they're not under threat. So I think the NATO expansion was a very, very good thing.
So you don't like
I am unsure about the missile shield. I think the construction of a certain missile shield has started already at Deveselu in Romania, and not I think, I know it for a fact. It's not the type of missile shield that was supposed to be in Poland and the Czech Republic. So but it is in a way aimed at stopping any type of nuclear attack that will come from Iran. This is my understanding from the Romanian officials. Also, you have all the bases at MK in Romania that are built right now to retreat the Afghanistan military through Romania. But I want to answer your question directly. And I think if you look at the last years, our resources were highly diverted from defending Europe. So we put a lot, as you know, in the Middle East. We put a lot in Afghanistan. What hurts me is to say Europe going down because Europe was the area where America was successful. More successful than in the Middle East, more successful than in Afghanistan. And Americans worked very hard for Europe. And I think we're slipping there because actually people say, oh, we diverted resources from the Afghanistan and Iraq or whatever. I am not exactly sure, right now what we're doing, but Europe may sleep. And that is our territory, a territory that we created, a territory where we brought democracy and we created stability. But in terms of the missile shield, it's there at Deveselu, and it is my understanding that it's going to prevent any kind of attack coming from Iran.
I don't know much about it, so sorry.
Are there additional guests? Ma'am.
Tatiana Zakrevska, International Affairs, graduate Bush School student. Thank you for the vivid discussion here. And I have the following question. We all agreed that Russia is testing the system now. First, it's tested on Georgia, now on Ukraine. As Dr. Thornton, you were right, we had elections on our territory, and it seems that we already lost Lugansk and Donetsk as well as Crimea. What I see now that we'll see more progress till the rest of the year, because logistically wise, there needs to be a route toward Crimea with the support. However, where will it be? Where will be the end? What's happening now? Will it be Transnistria or will it be further? Because as you also showed us that Russia is undermining European Union as a whole. United States and Europe imposed sanctions, but Russian Federation, it imposed back sanctions, and these sanctions actually need to worry because the sanctions on prohibiting to import goods from the European Union and from abroad on country, usually when the war was starting. So the governor needs to make the economy to be restructured so it can be self-sufficient. So it seems that that's what's going to happen in Russia now. So how do you think, what was going to happen? Is the war going to happen in Europe and Ukraine is going to be the last step, or the first step, or?
If you ask me, Tatiana, where is gonna stop? I think you're right to ask where is going to stop. First was Crimea. I mean, first was Georgia and the two. Then it came, then it, not the whole Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But then it came Crimea, and then the question is next, now it's coming Donetsk and Lugansk. It's pretty clear. And then the question is, are we gonna see Transnistria going? Look, probably, if the Russians want, what is it that we are going to do? We didn't do anything for Crimea. We didn't do anything for Georgia. The Russians might very well take Transnistria because nobody's going to do anything. And with respect to where Moldova should be, there is not much support for Moldova to go back to Romania among Romanians. The support is very thin, actually. So Transnistria is already occupied by the Russian military, so it may go, you know. But I don't think that we're looking further than that. And I think, again, the Russians have to think of their economy, if this is going to work, if they can sustain all these provinces or whatever they are taking, because if not, it's not going to be a good situation for them. Do I think I see war in Europe? I hope not. I really hope not, but I'm going to leave it to those gentlemen.
I don't think that there will be a war in Europe because I think that end of Putin will be in Ukraine. Putin desperately needs two corridors. One to Crimea, because Crimea is going to be frozen during the winter time, and they don't have any supply routes. That talks about building the bridge, land bridge, or the underwater tunnel. Theoretically, it's all possible, but it takes time, building either of that. So they need a bridge to Crimea. And second, they need access to Transnistria, because Transnistria is not going to last long if it's completely isolated. So these are the two primary targets. What Putin wants not to keep this so-called Novorossiya, but he wants to control decision-making in Kiev. And increasingly, it's not becoming possible. The moment that Ukrainians will get weapons, and sooner or later they will get weapons, they will fight. What we've learned about Ukrainians, they are good fighters, and they love their country. And they will fight any forces, doesn't matter the regular, irregular, they will fight for it. And there are many people who are ready to do it. And that will bring situation together with the sanctions. I believe that sanctions are not ideal, but they are working. And believe me, now with these so-called elections in Luhansk and Donetsk, Russia may get some extra sanctions. They don't need extra, but may get, even from European unions. And where the Balts come to play nicely in this story, that once EU impose the sanctions, it needs anonymity in lifting that. I doubt very much that at least 3 countries, I know for sure, will be opposing lifting these sanctions anytime soon. It's a long-term game, and Europeans and Americans are becoming very smart when it goes about on sanctions. And not because of Russia, because of Iran and everything that was happening to Iran. And we've seen it working in Iran. I think it will work in Russia. And I think what we are going to see is a whole Ukrainian and Georgian story backfiring to Russia. There will be no expansion of the warfare to other countries in Europe. There might be some attempts in the directions of Azerbaijan to cut the gas supply to Europeans or to have more leverage on the Europeans, and Kazakhstan for different reasons. But it's it. I think that Putin already hit his ceiling, and now it's coming down very, very quickly. It's just a matter of realization. I'll just quote my British colleague who said that Russia looks horrifying and increasing and imperial, whatever, if you look from Europe. But it's a degrading power if you look from the Asia. So take the Asian look. It's a degrading power. It can be playing the boogeyman now of the Europe. But what it takes is a US president with guts. That's it. It's not that the US cannot do anything. But US have to learn back what is the credible threat. Not Obama saying that there will be a red line and then it becomes a pink line. But when American president says something, it should be happening. And that's the biggest problem we are facing. It's not that Putin is such a great guy. Actually, President Bush, the young Bush, said Putin is a little tough little dude. So this country knows how to deal with tough little dudes. And if this country will act, everything will be fine. And sooner or later, this country will act, but before this country will act, Ukrainians will do.
I want to add something as a military man, even retired reserve officer. I'm somewhat pessimistic in this case. It would be, first of all, it would be difficult to support the Ukrainians simply by giving them the weapons they need. The Ukrainian army, their training and the command system is incredibly deficient. All those years that the Baltics and other countries westernized and did that, they did not. They did not reform their training, their higher command. Their logistics is a mess. Their support services are awful. All of their basic capabilities to operate as something other than companies, I'm sure they're brave, I'm sure they're dedicated, but they are in very, very bad shape militarily. They might have a lot of people. And then again, of course, they had the very serious problem, you had a lot of ethnic Russians in their intelligence forces. You need to go through and you vastly purge the old command to make that military effective. You need to do massive reforms. And in fact, I would be in favor of doing those things and giving the Ukraine that kind of support. But creating a force that could effectively defend their country, unfortunately, we should have done this year, they started late on this. It will take a few years to get the Ukrainians to the point where they can operate as brigades and battalions. Otherwise, it will be just badly conducted operations. And then the other issue, I'm not an expert on sanctions and diplomacy, but I do know that the energy card that the Russians hold, and is I know that because it's been used against the Lithuanians quite a bit and quite aggressively for a decade now.
But you know what happened 4 days ago, right?
Yeah, right now they have liquefied gas.
Yeah.
So Lithuania is completely independent, and basically the Baltics will be completely independent, so they will be happy there.
These are improvements, but if you want to answer Russia, you need to look forward for several years and have a plan to, as with Georgia, completely reform and rebuild the armed forces, which was certainly evident after 2008 that to make an effective Georgian forces, you needed very big changes. The Ukrainians need a years-long, very expensive process before they will be minimally capable of doing their things. And because Lithuania put a high priority, it's taken them a decade, finally, to solve the energy thing. And they were pressured very heavily by Russia on this issue. Europe has got to have a strategy to wean themselves off of dependence on Russian oil and gas. This is, issues like these. So basically what we need is a long-term strategy by the Europeans, by the Americans together to take those Russian cards and advantages off the table.
They are actually. I think that Europeans do have that. But the problem with America is that, for good reasons, American Congress did not allow for a long time gas and oil export. So if these restrictions will be lifted, and I believe they will be lifted, so you will see more and more oil and gas going on the world market, not necessarily to Europe because now the prices are higher in Asia, but it will balance the price. I think Ukrainians have something that Russians don't, and one of the supposed to be speaker that is not unfortunately here in this panel, I talked to him a couple of days ago, and he has a very compelling argument about Ukrainian situation. He said Russians operate with a narrative of the 70 years old, fascists, fascists. When Ukrainians have people dying now, and as our Russian student here correctly said, there are no families that didn't lose somebody in the Great Patriotic or the Second World War. The same way now Ukrainians have family members that they lost in war against Russia. That is going to hugely backfire to Russia. 3 years, 4 years, I don't have a crystal ball either, unfortunately, but it's inevitable. And Ukrainian army is already in the process of reform. They just adopted the legislation about lustration. They fired enormous amount of people already. There are more to be fired, but it's a process. But the moral high ground is on the Ukrainian side. And the history will judge everybody, I believe, sooner or later, and the coward European leaders that were trying to hide behind Putin will be very much exposed by the history. So it's not that they will be hiding behind Putin for a long time, but Ukrainians and Georgians have a high moral ground. This is our land, our country, and we are ready to fight. And what Georgians, we lost the battle, but we won the war in the sense that we show that it's possible to fight Russia. And Ukrainians learned in Georgia that it's possible. You may lose that particular battle, but it always makes sense to fight for your freedom.
Well, as a historian, I always like the closing with let's take the long view. So let's close and take the long view and give a hand to our presenters for a really, really helpful time.
Actually, Adam, I was going to ask one more question.
Oh, rats. Okay.
Yeah, and we've got a long break here. Real quick, of all the panelists to include Dr. Satter from this morning, we've kind of stepped all the way around it in many different ways and said it in a couple of different ways. I'd just like to kind of hear it in black and white because as an old soldier, I do much better in black and white. And as a Cold War soldier, I guess the question is this. We fought that war from the end of World War II all the way through into the 90s, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And, in many ways, there's a lot of people out there that think we're headed back that direction again. But not having asked any experts and having 4 in the room right now, do you think we're headed back to a Cold War anytime soon? Or do you think this is just something that'll pass and we'll move on from there?
You are not heading, you are already there. That's in my opinion. And you remember the Cold War was never clash between Soviets and Americans or Europeans or the NATO. It was a proxy war all the time. So you are already in the proxy war. You are challenged in so many places. But you know, there was a question about China. China is not doing the crazy things that the Russians are doing. China literally owns entire Africa already and big part of Latin America without fighting and shooting any bullet. I mean, we know there is a competition, but it's called competition, not the war. And the Chinese economy is slowing down. It's down to 6 or 7%. So I remember when entire Americans were saying, "Oh, Japan is raising power." Now it's China, and oh, BRICS, you know, the Brazil and I mean, come on, Ebola. I mean, I'm not big fond of this kind of media glitches. And you know, size-wise, yes, Chinese economy can be the largest, but that's not the most advanced economy in the world. In the same way, Cold War, yes, there is a Cold War already. We are in it, and you are in it, and it's a proxy war. It's already happening. But the big but is, I have to quote somebody that I very, very rarely quote, Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that history repeats itself. But when it repeats itself, second time it repeats as a farce. So Russia is merely a shadow of what Putin's Russia is, a shadow of what Soviet Union used to be. And this, you know, Cold War will not be a global, it's merely into Russia's neighborhood.
I don't think I could top what the ambassador said. I think he's explained the views very nicely.
Well, I also think the ambassador explained it very well. The Cold War was also a clash of ideas, and there are no real ideas here, even though the Russians occasionally pretend that there are. But will the situation get worse? And I think it will get worse because the situation inside Russia will get worse. And insofar as the internal situation in Russia begins to degrade, the need for an external enemy will become more acute. And the Putin leadership will feel more threatened. So I think that the prospect is for continuing and perhaps even deepening confrontation. So but not a global ideological conflict like the Cold War.
Oh, I was hoping you're not going to point that towards me. Well, I agree. I said it in the beginning. The United States of America, if it's challenged right now, is challenged regionally. So Russia will constitute a regional challenge to the U.S., but not a global challenge like we conceived that during the Cold War. I fully agree with that. So I think I won't even quite want to use the Cold War. I will say it's a big challenge that we're looking at, but maybe it's quite not the Cold War. And just because I'm hiding behind notions right now, not to give you an answer, but also it is true that the Cold War had a big component that was mentioned here, ideology. And right now, the Russians are trying to say, like the Chinese, we have an ideology. We have the Beijing consensus. Authoritarian regimes are the norm. Well, I'm not so sure that, you know, it's like quite what it was. So I think what we're seeing, my answer will be a regional challenge, not a global challenge, like during the Cold War.
What Gabriela is saying, that the real challenge, in my view, is not a confrontation between the United States and Russia or between Russia and other countries. Real challenge will be what happens if the situation inside Russia begins to become unstable. And under those circumstances, then there really could be a global crisis, because Russia is full of people with very extreme views. And as we've seen with the death toll in eastern Ukraine, there's absolutely no respect for human life. And so that, in fact, is the real, in my view, ultimate danger. that by virtue of their sheer criminality, they will so destabilize their own situation as to provoke a crisis that could draw in everyone else as well.
I want to comment, one of the Baltic generals that I've worked for, really fine mind, said very much the same thing. He says there's a greater danger or greater likelihood of future threat would not be the Russian army coming across the border. It would be an implosion in Russia, a great deal of disorder, and that spilling over into the Baltic states. And I just want you to know there's some Baltics that are thinking exactly on those lines and say we ought to plan for, or at least look at the strategic likelihood that is one of the possible scenarios. It's even a likely scenario in the future that a unstable Russia could be the mess. So just want to back you up on that.
That actually is very much used as an excuse to do nothing. Because people say, oh, if we are going to get rid of Putin, I don't know how one can get rid of Putin artificially. Those people are saying that, you know, the alternatives in Russia are fascists, nationalists, crazies. I don't think so. I think that Russians are full of very intelligent and smart people. And I don't think that, you know, the nuclear power necessarily will go in the hands of loonies. Because there is a lot of, there are a lot of sane people, even in the government in the Russian Federation. If somebody has a midlife crisis and is going bananas, doesn't mean that the entire nation can go bananas.
I think actually you're right, and if you remember the discussion was the same at the end of the Cold War, what we're going to do if Russia disintegrates. I mean, it disintegrated to a certain extent. I mean, Mr. Gorbachev woke up some morning and found out that he was the only unelected leader. He should have read how Suarez did the transition in Spain. You know, you first do general elections and then you leave others, you know, to elect their own provincial leaders. But I think right now it could be, I mean, it's a 50% chance. I don't want to put anything, but I can see where you're going. Russia may disintegrate, and that will be really a problem.
Please not.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want that.
I hope not. Yeah, you're very close. So I won't think the Georgians will want that. So it will be a neighborhood. I'm sure, Alexei, you don't want that. But
Alexei, you can ask afterwards. I want to smoke. You don't have to have a remark. You have to take power in your hand.
Ambassador Yakobashvili and Dr. Thornton said about, to some extent agree, about possible disintegration of my country. Well, speaking about how much is Russian population content with what Putin does on his internal and foreign policy, I should say we are not very happy with that, but the alternative is probably worse. Well, what happens if Putin is not here anymore, is not a leader of Russia? Probably Far East and part of Siberia will be annexed the same way we annexed Crimea by China. Some national republics in Northern Caucasus, and probably not even there, like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, they will secede. They already were going to secede at the end of Yeltsin's tenure, but Mr. Putin managed to stop that. And well, nationalists are not so strong, but they will have some influence in that case. So, unfortunately, now it is the choice between very bad and bad, not so good. And speaking about intelligent people, yes, we have many talented, intelligent people, but unfortunately, they are sometimes not in Russia. They are here and in Western Europe, and they keep going there. So I see the solution. Education is a solution. Development is a solution. If good and decent people stay in my country will prosper.
I have a very simple question. How on the earth, anybody, any sane people in your country would consider #1 enemy for a very long while Estonia, and then we substituted the #1 enemy of Russia was Georgia. I mean, we are such a small countries, insignificant in many other. I mean, for me, it's the most significant country, of course, but you never ask question to yourself, what happened to people of Russia that majority of people considered Estonia or Georgia as a #1 enemy? How, by default, Georgia can be enemy of Russia or Estonia can be enemy of Russia, #1 enemy? So the problem with the propaganda is that, you know, it's working. Inside Russia, it's working. So I agree with you, it's not only the education, because you have plenty of educated people, but people have to start differentiate propaganda from the truth. It was different in the Soviet Union. I lived in the Soviet Union, and like you are too young for that. We knew that it was BS. Okay, whatever was, we knew it. So there was always understanding, the reading among the lines. It's not the case in Russia now. People really take it seriously, what these broadcasters are broadcasting. That's a huge problem for Russia, and probably somebody have to think about breaking that vicious circle for the sake of Russia, not for the sake of Americans or Europeans.
I would say we continue this over dinner. Thank you very much to our panelists and to all of you for coming.
Actually, there was a time.
Can I just have one word in the absence of Professor Natsios? I wanted to, on behalf of the Scowcroft Institute, thank our other sponsors, the Glasscock Center on the Humanities here at Texas A&M and the History Department, and just ask you to join me in thanking our panel, not just Professor Marin Thornton, Ambassador Yakobashvili, and Professor Corum, but also Professor Seif for moderating.